Super December 1944. Snow falls, not gently, but in a hard, persistent curtain of white. It clings to the dark pines of the forest, muffling the world in a deep, oppressive silence. Each breath is a cloud of ice crystals, instantly freezing to wool scarves and eyebrows. Below a snow-laden fir tree, a steel helmet, dusted with powder, peeks over a log. The man beneath it is young. His knuckles are white, gripping the frozen stock of his M1 Garand. He no longer feels his toes. His enemy is not just the German soldier hidden in the trees ahead. It is the cold itself, a relentless, silent predator that seeps through his thin field jacket and worn leather boots. The sharp crack of a Mauser rifle echoes, flat and dead in the frigid air. He is an American soldier. But this is not the Ardennes. This is not Bastogne. This is a front forgotten by the headlines, a private war waged in a frozen hell. And for the men fighting here, survival was measured not in miles gained, but in one more sunrise. That single sunrise was earned at a terrible cost, a cost repeated daily across a front born from a grand strategic design. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had a relentless momentum. The Allied breakout from Normandy was a torrent. Washing over France, Paris was liberated. The German 7th Army, shattered in the Falaise pocket, was in full retreat. The end of the war seemed within reach. A victory by Christmas was the prevailing hope. But this was only half the story. On August 15th, 1944, 2 months after D-Day, a second invasion force had stormed ashore. Operation Dragoon. The beaches of the French Riviera, from Toulon to Cannes, were swarmed by American and Free French soldiers. This was the U.S. 7th Army under Lieutenant General Alexander Patch and the French 1st Army. Their objective: push north up the Rhone Valley, destroy the German forces in southern France, and link up with the main Allied armies driving east from Normandy. Their advance was stunningly fast. The German 19th Army, unable to form a coherent defense, fell back. Marseille, Lyon, city after city, was liberated. On September 12th, near Dijon, patrols from the 7th Army met patrols from General Patton's 3rd Army. For the first time, the Allied line was a single, unbroken front, stretching 600 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. This southern flank was commanded by Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers' 6th Army Group. Their path into Germany was direct, but not simple. It led straight into a natural fortress, a dark, brooding range of mountains that had guarded the Germanic frontier for centuries, the Vosges. To the Romans, they were the Vosegus Silva, the forest of the god Vosegus, a wild, impenetrable barrier of granite peaks, dense fir forests, and steep, winding valleys. For the German High Command in the autumn of 1944, they were the last great shield before the Rhine River and the sacred soil of the fatherland. Here, the retreat would stop. Here, they would make a stand. The German 19th Army, battered but not broken, dug in. They knew this terrain intimately. They fortified the narrow mountain passes, the cols. They zeroed their mortars on the forest trails and registered their artillery on every clearing. They transformed the ancient mountains into a modern fortress of interlocking machine gun nests, minefields, and camouflaged bunkers. They were no longer fighting for France. They were fighting for Germany. Against this desperate defense was thrown the U.S. 7th Army. Its divisions, the 3rd, the 36th, the 45th, the 100th, were filled with veterans. Men who had fought their way up the boot of Italy, who had clawed their way ashore at Anzio and Salerno. They were hardened soldiers, accustomed to hard fighting, but they were not mountain troops. Their equipment, their training, their very mindset was for a war of movement, across the rolling hills of France. The fighting began in October. It was a slow, grinding horror, a battle for inches. American units would spend days fighting their way up a single wooded slope, only to be thrown back by a sudden, vicious counterattack. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Sickness and trench foot became as dangerous as enemy fire. The fighting was so brutal, so claustrophobic in the dense woods, it earned a chilling name from the GIs who endured it: the Little Casino. Towns like Bruyères and Saint-Dié became focal points of unimaginable violence. Each house, each street corner, was a separate battle. The advance was measured not in miles, but in yards. By November, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, the men of the 7th Army had paid in blood for every foot of ground. They were exhausted, depleted, and facing an enemy who seemed to grow stronger the closer they got to Germany. The world's attention, however, was beginning to shift. The headlines focused on the major efforts to the north, the fight for the Hürtgen Forest, the push towards the Roer River dams. The 6th Army Group's grim struggle in the mountains was becoming a footnote. The men felt it. They were the forgotten flank, fighting a private war in a world of trees and rock. And as the autumn chill deepened into the bone-cracking cold of winter, their isolation was about to become absolute. Their isolation was not just a feeling. It was a strategic fact, dictated by maps in a distant headquarters. As winter tightened its grip, the Allied Supreme Command made a calculated decision. The main effort, the knockout blow against Germany, would come in the north. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr was the prize. General Eisenhower began to concentrate his power there, funneling men, fuel, and supplies to the armies of Bradley and Montgomery. The 6th Army Group on the southern flank was redesignated an economy of force theater, a military term for a holding action. Their orders were to maintain pressure, to fix German units in place, but to do so with limited resources. They were the anchor, not the spearhead. The supply trucks that rolled east from the Normandy beaches now turned north more often than south. The 7th Army was at the end of the longest, thinnest supply line in Europe. This meant everything was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Hot meals became a luxury. But most critically, they lacked the basic tools of winter warfare. The GIs were still wearing the same M9943 field jackets and leather combat boots they had worn in the temperate autumn. The boots, once wet, would freeze solid. Trench foot, a condition that rots the flesh from the bone, became epidemic. Cases of frostbite soared. Winter clothing, like insulated shoe packs and heavy parkas, existed, but they were being sent north. The men in the Vosges were told to make do. They faced an enemy who was already home. General Friedrich Wiese's 19th Army was a battered but cohesive force. They were a mix of hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, young, fanatical replacements from the Hitler Youth, and older men of the Volkssturm, the Home Guard. What they lacked in equipment, they made up for in desperation and local knowledge. They knew every trail, every ravine. They endured the cold with a grim resolve because just over the mountains was their homeland. For them, this was not a battle for a foreign country. It was the final defense of Germany itself. The weather became a third combatant, allied with the Germans. The autumn rains that had turned the forest floor into a sea of mud gave way to sleet, then snow. The temperature plummeted. Rifles froze. The oil and machine guns congealed into useless sludge. Water in canteens turned to ice. A wounded man, left unattended for even a short time, would freeze to death. The endless canopy of pine trees, now heavy with snow, blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The war became a claustrophobic struggle in a frozen labyrinth. And in this forgotten corner of the front, the German High Command saw an opportunity. While the world's attention was fixed on the massive German buildup opposite the Ardennes, a second secret plan was taking shape. Hitler, obsessed with repeating the successes of 1940, believed the American line was stretched thin, especially in the South. He saw the undersupplied, exhausted divisions of the U.S. Seventh Army as a weak point, a place where a sudden, violent blow could shatter the Allied flank. He ordered the creation of a new army group under the command of Heinrich Himmler himself. Their mission, Operation Nordwind, North Wind, a massive counteroffensive to be launched through the Vosges on New Year's Eve. Its goal was to annihilate the Seventh Army, recapture Alsace, and relieve the pressure on the German forces in the Ardennes. The American soldiers, in their frozen foxholes, knew nothing of this. They knew only the cold, the snow, and the enemy in the trees across the way. They were holding a quiet front, a forgotten front. But the enemy had not forgotten them. And in the deep silence of the winter forests, a new storm was gathering. That gathering storm was not just one of men and steel. It was a convergence of forces, a battle fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, even within the confines of a single foxhole. For the American GI in the Vosges, the war was a deeply personal, elemental struggle. It was a war against the mountain, a war against the enemy, and most of all, a war against the cold. This was the soldier's reality. A world shrunk to the few feet of frozen earth he occupied. The primary enemy was not a man in a field gray uniform, but the temperature itself. It was an insidious foe that attacked without cease. Metal on a rifle became so cold it would tear the skin from a bare hand. A simple act, like cleaning a weapon, required removing gloves. A calculated risk that could end in frostbitten fingers. The M1 Garand, a masterpiece of engineering, could be rendered inert by a single drop of frozen condensation on its operating rod. Lubricating oil thickened into useless paste. Hand grenades sometimes failed to detonate, their chemical fuses defeated by the extreme cold. Survival became a series of small, desperate rituals, stuffing newspapers inside a field jacket for insulation, huddling together for shared body heat, trying to warm frozen K-ration cans over a tiny, smokeless fire that was itself a beacon for enemy mortars. Medics treated as many cases of trench foot and exposure as they did shrapnel wounds. A soldier's feet, perpetually wet and cold inside his leather boots, would swell, turn blue, then black. The flesh would die. For these men, victory was not taking the next ridge. It was surviving until the next morning. This brutal individual struggle was a direct result of a larger tactical failure. The United States Army was an instrument built for a different kind of war. Its doctrine was founded on overwhelming firepower and rapid mechanized movement. It was designed to smash through enemy lines on open ground, with tanks, artillery, and air power working in concert. In the Vosges Mountains, this doctrine shattered. The dense forests and steep, narrow valleys rendered tanks almost useless, confining them to predictable roads that were easily mined and covered by anti-tank guns. Artillery, the king of battle, was neutered. Shells that would have devastated troops in the open exploded harmlessly in the tops of the thick pine trees, a phenomenon known as a tree burst, which rained deadly splinters of wood and steel down indiscriminately on both sides. The constant cloud cover and falling snow grounded the fighter-bombers of the Thukydian Tactical Air Command for days on end. The American war machine, with all its industrial might, was choked by the terrain. The conflict evolved into something more primitive. It became a war of infantry. A series of desperate small unit actions fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets for control of a single pillbox or a bend in a forest trail. On the other side of that trail was an enemy perfectly suited to this fight. The German 19th Army was a composite force, but it was fighting on its own terms. Its soldiers were a mix of battle-hardened veterans transferred from the Eastern Front who understood winter warfare intimately, and young, zealous NCOs from officer candidate schools. They were supplemented by older men from the Volkssturm, who may have lacked training but knew every path and ravine of their native soil. Their equipment was often inferior, their fuel and ammunition scarce, but they held one supreme advantage. They were defending the doorstep of their homeland. This gave them a desperate, unyielding resolve. They used the terrain with cunning skill, turning every ridge into a fortress and every valley into a killing ground. They would allow American squads to advance up a slope, only to annihilate them with interlocking machine gun fire from hidden, dug-in positions. They let the mountains and the winter do much of the work for them, bleeding the 7th Army for every foot of frozen ground. This intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with a fanatic's desperation, was now being forged into the spearhead of Hitler's final gamble in the West. That spearhead was aimed at a vacuum, a blind spot on the strategic map of Europe, created by Allied confidence and competing priorities. Far from the frozen foxholes, another war was being fought on paper. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, commanding the 6th Army Group, saw the danger clearly. His reports to Supreme Headquarters were stark. They detailed the exhaustion of his men, the brutal terrain, the critical shortages of winter gear. He argued for reinforcements, for supplies, for a recognition of the meat grinder his troops were trapped in. But his voice was a whisper in a storm. All attention, all resources were being drawn north. Eisenhower's eyes were fixed on the Ardennes and the Ruhr. The Southern Front was a problem to be contained, not a front to be won. This strategic neglect had a direct consequence on the ground. Allied intelligence, focused on the massive German buildup for the Battle of the Bulge, missed the subtler signs of a second offensive. Ultra-intercepts hinted at troop movements toward the Saar region, but they were dismissed as defensive repositioning or a minor spoiling attack. The 7th Army's own intelligence officers noted the arrival of new German divisions, but their warnings were lost in the noise. The American command was looking in one direction, while Hitler prepared to strike from another. For the men shivering in the Vosges, this meant they were on their own. They were the forgotten flank, holding a line deemed secondary. Facing an enemy whose deadly intentions were completely unknown to the generals who read the maps, this command blindness compounded a deeper crisis already unfolding within the ranks, a war of attrition against the human body itself. The cold was a systematic biological weapon. Trench foot was its most insidious agent. It began with numbness, a welcome relief from the pain of the cold. But it was a lie, inside the waterlogged, frozen leather of a GI's boot. The flesh was dying. Blood vessels constricted, tissues were starved of oxygen, and gangrene began its silent, blackening advance. Medics saw men hobble in, their feet swollen and discolored, looking like grotesque purple clubs. Frostbite was more sudden. A moment of carelessness, a glove removed to clear a rifle jam, and the skin would freeze, turning waxy white. The pain upon rewarming was excruciating, a searing fire in the nerves. Beyond these physical wounds was a creeping psychological decay, the endless gray twilight under the snow-heavy pines, the constant, unseen threat. The jarring crack of a tree burst overhead. It wore men down. Combat exhaustion cases skyrocketed. Men who had endured the worst of Italy simply broke. They were not cowards. They were human machines pushed beyond their mechanical limits. The aid stations, set up in freezing farmhouses or drafty tents, were scenes from a nightmare. Plasma froze. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed in a medic's mouth before they could be injected. Evacuating a wounded man was a Herculean task, a slow, agonizing journey on a stretcher through deep snow, often under the watchful eyes of German snipers. The Seventh Army was not just being bled by enemy action. It was being hollowed out from within by the elements. The German spearhead was aimed not at a fortified line, but at an army already besieged. An army whose soldiers were fighting for their own survival, whose commanders were starved of resources, and whose leaders were blind to the coming storm. The storm broke in the final hour of the year, December 31st, 1944. 2,300 hours. Along the frozen front of the U.S. Seventh Army, a deceptive quiet had fallen. In scattered command posts, men listened to armed forces radio, to the sounds of celebration from a world away. They thought of home. They believed the enemy was as exhausted, as frozen, as they were. They were wrong. The attack did not begin with a thunderous artillery barrage. It began with the whispers. The crunch of boots on frozen snow muffled by the falling flakes. The snap of a twig. Across a 50-mile front, elite German mountain troops and Volksgrenadiers of the First Army were slipping through the American lines. They moved in small groups, wearing white camouflage smocks, invisible against the snow. They bypassed the main strong points, seeking the seams, the weak points between the isolated American companies. The first sign of trouble was the sudden silence of an outpost, a listening post that failed to check in. Then a single flare hissed into the night sky, its brief magnesium glare revealing ghost-like figures already inside the American wire. The radios crackled to life with frantic, disjointed reports. Men from the 100th Infantry Division near Bitche, the 44th near Rimling, spoke of Germans in their rear, of attacks coming from all directions at once. Machine guns opened up, their flat chatter swallowed by the dense, snow-laden forests. The German plan was one of infiltration and encirclement. It was brutally effective. By dawn on January 1st, 1945, the scope of Operation Nordwind was terrifyingly clear. This was no local probe. This was a major offensive. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz's Army Group G had thrown 5 corps against the thinly stretched American line. The 3rd Fleet SS Army Corps slammed into the divisions guarding the Severn Gap, the historic gateway through the Vosges. To the north, the LXXX and LXX Infantry Corps sought to encircle and destroy the U.S. 15 Corps. For the men on the ground, the strategic map was irrelevant. Their world had collapsed into a desperate fight for survival. Companies were cut off. Platoons were surrounded. Ammunition ran low. The cold was as lethal as the enemy. Wounded men froze where they fell. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand in the confines of a snow-filled trench or the rubble of an Alsatian farmhouse. The forgotten front had become the epicenter of a new crisis. At Supreme Headquarters, the news from the south landed like a hammer blow. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging, consuming every available reserve. General Eisenhower faced a nightmare scenario. 2 massive German offensives, tearing at both the center and the southern flank of his front. He had no fresh divisions to send south. The 7th Army was on its own. A stark choice had to be made. Eisenhower, looking at the map, saw an overextended line, a salient that was difficult to supply and impossible to defend against a determined attack. On January 3rd, he made a cold, calculated military decision. He ordered General Divers to conduct a phased withdrawal. The Seventh Army was to pull back from the plains of Alsace, abandoning the ground they had paid for in blood. They were to retreat to a shorter, more defensible line anchored on the eastern slopes of the Vosges Mountains. The decision was logical. It was also brutal. It meant surrendering territory. It meant abandoning the city of Strasbourg. This order ignited a political firestorm. For the French, Strasbourg was more than a city. It was a sacred symbol of national sovereignty, lost to Germany in 1871, regained in 1918, and only recently liberated. The commander of the French First Army, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, was apoplectic. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, flew into a rage. He saw the American order as a betrayal, a stain on French honor. He threatened to pull the entire French First Army out from under Eisenhower's command and defend Strasbourg alone, an act that would have shattered the Allied coalition. The generals argued. The politicians postured. But on the frozen ground, the order was already filtering down. An order to retreat, to give up the foxholes, the ridges, the towns they had fought and died for. For the men of the 36th, 45th, and 79th Divisions, it was an incomprehensible betrayal. But for the units already cut off, already surrounded by the tide of the German advance, the order was something else entirely. It was a fantasy, a strategic decision made in a warm headquarters that had no bearing on their reality. They could not fall back. There was nowhere left to fall back to. There was nowhere to fall back to. For the men of the 79th Infantry Division, near the town of Hatton, or the tankers of the 14th Armored Division fighting alongside them, the war was a 360-degree circle of fire. The German offensive had flowed around them, cutting them off completely. The battle for Hatton and its neighboring village, Rittershofen, devolved into one of the most savage small-unit engagements of the entire war. It was a fight waged in the rubble of stone houses, in the darkness of frozen cellars, and across snow-swept gardens. An American Sherman tank would duel a German Panzer at point-blank range across a village square. A squad of GIs would clear a farmhouse room by room, only to be attacked from the rear by German troops who had infiltrated through the adjoining building. For 2 weeks, the two villages became a meat grinder, consuming men and machines from both sides. There was no front line. There was only the next building, the next wall. The men here were not holding a strategic position. They were simply trying to stay alive, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. While they fought for their lives, the fate of the entire front was being decided in a clash of wills, far from the sound of the guns. At his headquarters in Versailles, General Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Military logic demanded a withdrawal. The Seventh Army was in danger of being encircled and destroyed. But Charles de Gaulle's ultimatum was absolute. The defense of Strasbourg was a non-negotiable matter of French national honor. To abandon it, de Gaulle warned, would have grave consequences for the unity of the Allied command. Eisenhower, a pragmatist, saw a line on a map that was dangerously exposed. De Gaulle saw the soul of France. The pressure was immense. Winston Churchill sided with the French. Eisenhower's own generals, Bradley and Devers, argued for the military necessity of the withdrawal. For days, the alliance teetered on a knife's edge. Finally, on January 5th, Eisenhower relented. He made one of the most difficult decisions of his career, choosing the political cohesion over tactical prudence. He reversed his order. The Seventh Army would not retreat. Strasbourg would be held. The new order crackled over the radios to the command posts in the Vosges. Hold at all costs. For the generals, it was a new, perilous directive. For the men in the cellars of Hatton, the words changed nothing. They were already holding at all costs, but the decision sent a powerful message down the line. They were no longer the forgotten flank. Their sacrifice had a purpose. Reinforcements, though scarce, began to be rerouted. The newly arrived 42nd Rainbow Division was thrown into the fray. Ammunition convoys, braving treacherous, ice-covered roads, began to reach the beleaguered units. The 7th Army stiffened its back. The Germans of Army Group G threw everything they had left into the offensive. Panzergrenadier divisions, supported by the last of their armored reserves, hammered against the American positions. They punched a deep salient into the American lines near the Motor River. But they could not break them. The American GI, fighting from a frozen foxhole or the shattered window of a farmhouse, refused to yield. He was outgunned and outnumbered, but he held his ground. The men who had survived the mountains were not easily broken. They had learned a brutal form of warfare, a stubbornness that came from enduring the unendurable. By the 3rd week of January, the German offensive began to sputter. The momentum was gone, bled away in the streets of a dozen Alsatian villages. The German supply lines, already strained, could not support the intensity of the fighting. Their fuel ran low, their ammunition dwindled. Their best assault troops were dead or wounded, lying in the snow next to the Americans they had fought. The spearhead of Operation Nordwind, forged in desperation, had been blunted and then broken against the simple, bloody-minded courage of the American infantryman. On January 25, 1945, the German High Command officially terminated Operation Nordwind. The attack was a failure. The exhausted German units began a slow, grudging withdrawal. A quiet began to settle over the battlefield. Not the quiet of peace, but the profound, echoing silence that follows a storm. The snow continued to fall, covering the wreckage of tanks, the craters from artillery, and the bodies of the fallen in a clean white shroud. The line had held. The forgotten front had survived its greatest test, but survival had come at a staggering price, one now being tallied in the frozen aid stations and the quiet rows of graves. That price was tallied in a silence broken only by the wind whistling through the skeletal remains of forests and villages. When the guns of Operation Nordwind finally fell silent on January 25th, what was left was a frozen, shattered landscape. The snow, which had been a relentless enemy, now served as a vast white shroud, hiding the worst of the carnage beneath its clean surface. But it could not hide everything. The villages of Hatton and Rittershofen, the epicenter of the fighting, had ceased to exist as living communities. They were monuments of ruin. Not a single building was left undamaged. After-action reports described the scene with stark, disbelieving language. The 79th Infantry Division reported that of Hatton's 250 houses, 230 were completely destroyed. The rest were mere shells. The streets were impassable, choked with the rubble of stone homes and the burned-out hulks of American Shermans and German Panzers, sometimes only yards apart, frozen in their final duel. For weeks, the dead of both armies lay where they had fallen, preserved by the bitter cold. The human cost was equally stark. The U.S. 7th Army had suffered nearly 12,000 battle casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. But that number was a deceptive fraction of the total toll. Over 17,000 more men were lost as non-battle casualties. They were the victims of the cold, trench foot, frostbite, pneumonia, and sheer physical exhaustion. An entire division's worth of men, incapacitated without firing a shot. The German losses were even more severe. Army Group G had lost an estimated 23,000 men. These were not raw recruits. They were veteran assault troops and panzer grenadiers. Men the Third Reich could no longer replace. In purely military terms, the outcome was clear. The Americans had won a decisive defensive victory. They had held the line. They had stopped Hitler's last offensive gamble in the West. General Devers, in his official report, noted the fighting had been as vicious as any seen in this war, a testament to the brutal determination of his soldiers. For the Germans, Nordwind was an unmitigated disaster. It achieved none of its strategic objectives. It did not destroy the Seventh Army. It did not recapture Strasbourg. It did not relieve the pressure on the Ardennes front. It only succeeded in burning out the last of Germany's offensive power, expending irreplaceable men and machines for a few miles of worthless, snow-covered ground. It was a strategic death rattle. The line had held. The front was secure. But as the spring thaw began to reveal the true extent of the devastation, it became clear that the battle had inflicted wounds deeper than any casualty list could show. The numbers told a story of sacrifice, but they could not capture the full truth of what had been lost or why it would so quickly be erased from the popular memory of the war. That erasure from memory began almost immediately. It was a casualty of scale and timing. While the Seventh Army fought its desperate battle in the South, the world's attention was transfixed by a larger, more dramatic struggle 100 miles to the north. The Battle of the Bulge, the Siege of Bastogne, Patton's epic relief column, the sheer size of the German gamble in the Ardennes. These events created a powerful, simple narrative that consumed headlines and captured the public imagination. Operation Nordwind was a complex, grinding affair, a defensive victory fought in obscure villages by divisions whose numbers were not household names. It was a vital battle, but it lacked a compelling story for a world eager for a clear path to victory. History is written by the victors, but it is remembered through its grandest chapters. The final months of the war in Europe provided them in rapid succession. As the Seventh Army consolidated its lines in the Vosges, the main Allied armies were already preparing for the final push, the crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the liberation of the death camps, the race to Berlin. These monumental events quickly overshadowed the brutal winter fighting. The struggle in the Vosges became a footnote, a bloody prelude to the final act. The men who fought there were folded into the larger story of the victorious Allied armies, their unique ordeal lost in the sweep of the final triumph. Yet the consequences of their stand were profound. By absorbing and defeating Operation Nordwind, the Seventh Army and the Sixth Army Group had shattered the last significant German reserve force on the Western Front. The divisions that were bled white in the streets of Hattin were the same divisions that were supposed to be defending the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. The American soldiers in their frozen foxholes had served as an anvil, upon which Hitler's final offensive weapon was broken. When the time came for the final Allied push into Germany in March 1945, the southern flank was not a source of danger, but a springboard for attack. The Seventh Army crossed the Rhine with relative ease, its path cleared by the sacrifice of the winter. The political crisis over Strasbourg also left a lasting mark. Eisenhower's decision to hold the city, against the advice of his field commanders, was a testament to his understanding that this was a war of coalition. It was a political victory that solidified the alliance at a critical moment, reaffirming the sovereignty and honor of a reborn France. It ensured that the final victory would be a shared one, preserving the unity that was essential for the post-war peace. But for the men who endured it, the battle's true legacy was not strategic or political. It was deeply personal. They were veterans of a different kind of war. They had not fought in the sweeping tank battles of the French plains or the celebrated hedgerows of Normandy. They had fought a claustrophobic, primitive war against the trees, the mountains, and the cold. They carried the memory of tree bursts, of the insidious creep of trench foot, of fighting an enemy they could rarely see in a forest that seemed to go on forever. They were the survivors of the little casino, the forgotten flank, the quiet front that had suddenly exploded into a maelstrom. The grand histories recorded the victory, but for the men who earned it, the war in the Vosges was never truly over. It lived on, not on the pages of history books, but in the quiet corners of memory. It lived on, not on the pages of history books, but in the quiet corners of memory. In those quiet corners, the snow never truly melts. The wind still carries the ghost of a sound. The forests of the Vosges are peaceful now. The trees have healed their scars. The villages have been rebuilt, stone by stone. But the ground itself remembers. It holds the rust of shrapnel, the remnants of a forgotten front. The story of the American soldiers in the Vosges is a testament to a difficult truth. Not all sacrifice is remembered equally. History in its telling demands a simple narrative. It gravitates towards famous generals, decisive breakthroughs, and cities with recognizable names. It often has no room for the grinding, anonymous horror of a holding action in a frozen forest. But the importance of a battle is not measured by its fame. It is measured by its consequence. The stand of the Seventh Army was the unseen anchor that held the entire Allied line. It was a victory won not by grand strategy or overwhelming technology, but by the simple, stubborn refusal of individual men to break. It proved that the modern war machine, with all its power, could be humbled by terrain, by weather, and by the desperate courage of a defending enemy. Ultimately, this was a war against the elements as much as against an army, a war against the cold, against the mountain, against the feeling of being left behind. The men who fought here were not seeking glory. They were fighting for the man in the next foxhole. They were fighting for one more sunrise. Their names are not etched on the great monuments of the war. Their battle is a footnote in the grand histories. But their legacy is written into the landscape itself. It is in the silence of the high passes, in the deep woods of Alsace. A quiet testament to the forgotten soldiers who were asked to hold the line in the coldest of places, and who did not fail.